Most people misunderstand retention. They think it adds something to them. More discipline, more focus, more control. But that's not what actually happens. Retention doesn't give you anything new. It reveals what was already there. Your patterns, your impulses, your level of control. Even the parts of yourself you usually avoid seeing. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable. Because without constant release, distraction, or escape, there's nothing left to hide behind. What remains is you. Unfiltered. And most people aren't prepared for what that exposes. Because retention is not a transformation tool. It's a mirror. And once you start looking into it long enough, you begin to notice something deeper. It doesn't just show your strengths. It amplifies them. But at the same time, it quietly exposes your weaknesses in ways you can't ignore. What most people never realize is this. Retention doesn't change your personality. It intensifies it. If you are naturally disciplined, you become more structured, more precise, more controlled. But if you are scattered, impulsive, easily distracted, that doesn't disappear. It becomes more visible, more obvious, harder to ignore. Think about it. When energy is constantly being released, it dulls your internal state. It smooths over your inconsistencies. But when that release stops, there is pressure. And pressure doesn't create character. It reveals it. This is something ancient disciplines understood deeply. In early Stoic practices, restraint wasn't about suppression. It was about observation. They knew that when you remove comfort and excess, you don't become someone new. You see who you already are, without distortion. And that's exactly what retention does. It removes a layer of noise. So what's underneath becomes clearer. In the modern world, most people never experience this clarity. Because there's always an outlet. Always a distraction. Always a way to avoid sitting with your own patterns. But when that option is removed, your habits become louder. Your thoughts become sharper. Your tendencies become undeniable. And this is where the real shift begins. Because now, you can't blame your environment. You can't say, "I'll fix it later." You're faced with something much more direct. Your current level of self-control. Your current level of awareness. Your current level of discipline. And whether you like it or not, retention forces you to see it clearly. But this is only the first layer. Because once your personality is intensified, something else starts to happen. Something most people don't expect. And it changes how you relate to your own mind entirely. Here's where it gets interesting. The same traits you consider strengths don't always work in your favor under retention. They become amplified. And amplification doesn't discriminate. It sharpens everything. Your focus becomes deeper. But so does your obsession. Your discipline becomes stronger. But so does your rigidity. Your ambition becomes clearer. But so does your impatience. So the question is no longer, do you have strengths? The real question becomes, can you handle them when they intensify? Because most people assume strength is always positive. But under pressure, uncontrolled strength turns into imbalance. This is something ancient warrior cultures understood well. In places like Sparta, discipline wasn't just about becoming strong. It was about controlling strength. Because a man with power but no restraint was seen as dangerous, even to his own people. And that same principle applies here. Retention increases internal energy. And that energy feeds whatever is already dominant in you. If you are focused, it fuels precision. If you are reactive, it fuels intensity. If you are grounded, it builds stability. But if you are unstable, it magnifies that too. Think about that. Retention doesn't choose what to grow. It simply removes the dampening effect that was keeping things moderate. So now, your strengths don't just exist quietly in the background. They step forward. They demand expression. And if you're not aware, they can start controlling you instead of serving you. In the modern world, this often shows up subtly. You become more productive, but also less patient with others. You become more driven, but less tolerant of rest. You become more focused, but disconnected from balance. And at first, this feels like progress. But over time, you begin to notice something else. Your strengths, when unchecked, begin to create new problems. And this is the shift most people miss. Because they think the goal is to increase their strengths. But the real goal is to refine how those strengths are used. To bring awareness into them. To guide them, instead of being driven by them. Because without that awareness, even your best qualities can quietly work against you. And once you start seeing that, another layer reveals itself. Not just what's strong in you, but what's unstable. And unlike your strengths, these don't feel empowering when they surface. They feel uncomfortable, difficult to sit with, and almost impossible to ignore. This is the part most people don't talk about, because it's not comfortable. When you remove constant release, when you stop using distraction as an escape, your weaknesses don't disappear. They surface, clearly, and without warning. Habits you thought were under control suddenly feel stronger. Impulses you used to ignore become harder to dismiss. Patterns you never questioned start repeating themselves in ways you can't overlook. And this creates friction. Internal friction. Because now, there's a gap between who you think you are and what your behavior is showing you in real time. Think about that for a second. Most people don't actually lack discipline. They lack awareness of where they break it. And in normal conditions, that lack of awareness is easy to maintain. There's always something to blame. Stress, environment, timing. But under retention, those excuses begin to collapse. Because you're no longer numbing the signal. You're feeling it. Directly. This is something deeply understood in ancient monastic traditions. In early Buddhist practice, especially within Vipassana, the goal wasn't to fix the mind immediately. It was to observe it. To sit still long enough that every impulse, every discomfort, every hidden tendency rises to the surface. Not to punish yourself, but to see clearly. Because only what is seen clearly can be understood. And only what is understood can be changed. That's the same function retention begins to serve. It strips away avoidance. So your internal patterns become visible. And once they're visible, you can't pretend they're not there. You start noticing things like how quickly your mind looks for stimulation, how easily your focus breaks under pressure, how often you negotiate with your own standards. And this realization can go two ways. Some people see it and immediately try to escape again. They go back to distraction, back to release, back to comfort. Not because they're weak, but because clarity feels intense when you're not used to it. But others, they stay with it. They observe. They begin to understand their own patterns at a deeper level. And that's where something important starts to form. Not discipline yet. Not control. But awareness. And that awareness changes how you respond. Because now, when a weakness shows up, it doesn't catch you completely off guard. You see it forming. You recognize the pattern. And that gives you something most people never develop. A moment of choice. But even that is only part of the process. Because seeing your weaknesses is one thing. Sitting with them, without reacting, that's a completely different challenge. And that's where the next layer begins. Here's where the dynamic shifts. Most people think self-control is about resisting temptation. But under retention, you start to see something more precise. It's not about whether you react. It's about when. Because every impulse has a lifespan. A rise, a peak, and a fall. And if you've never paid attention to that before, retention makes it impossible to ignore. An urge appears. Your mind immediately tries to justify it. To act on it. To resolve it quickly. But if you don't move, if you just observe, something unexpected happens. It passes. Not because you fought it. Not because you suppressed it. But because you didn't feed it. Think about that. The impulse didn't control you. Your reaction to it did. This is where real control begins to take shape. Not in force, but in timing. This idea wasn't new. In traditions like Stoicism, control was never defined as eliminating impulses. It was defined as creating space between stimulus and response. A gap. A moment where awareness steps in before action. Because in that gap, you are no longer automatic. You are deliberate. And retention trains this without you even realizing it at first. Because when the usual outlets are removed, you're left face to face with your impulses in real time. You feel them rise. You feel the tension. You feel the pull to act. And for the first time, you can actually study it. Not theoretically, but directly. You start noticing patterns like how quickly an urge demands action, how your mind tries to rationalize it, how uncomfortable it feels to simply wait, but also how temporary it really is. And this changes something fundamental, because now, instead of seeing impulses as commands, you begin to see them as events, passing states, signals, not instructions. And that distinction is everything. Because once you realize an impulse doesn't have to be followed immediately, you gain something most people never develop: control over timing. You choose when to act, or whether to act at all. And in that space, your decisions become intentional instead of reactive. But here's the part most people don't expect. That space can feel uncomfortable, even unsettling, because you're no longer escaping the urge. You're sitting with it, fully aware. And that requires a different kind of strength. Not force, not suppression, but stability. The ability to remain steady while something inside you is pushing for release. And once you begin to develop that, you start to notice another shift. Your relationship with discomfort itself begins to change. And that is where things get even deeper. At this point, something subtle begins to change. Discomfort no longer feels like something you need to escape. It becomes something you can sit with. At first, this isn't pleasant. When you stop reacting, when you stop immediately relieving tension, you feel everything more directly. Restlessness, pressure, mental noise. And the instinct is still there. Do something. Fix it. Get rid of it. But if you don't, if you stay still long enough, you begin to notice something most people never realize. Discomfort is not constant. It moves. It rises, shifts, fades, returns. It's not a solid force. It's a pattern. And once you see that pattern clearly, it loses some of its authority over you. This is something ancient disciplines trained deliberately. In practices like Zazen, the goal wasn't relaxation. It was exposure. Sitting still, often in discomfort, not to suffer, but to understand the nature of that discomfort without reacting to it. Because the moment you stop labeling discomfort as bad, you stop being controlled by the need to escape it. And that's exactly what begins to happen here. Retention removes your quickest exit. So instead of running, you observe. And observation changes your relationship with the experience. You start to notice that the urge to escape discomfort is often stronger than the discomfort itself. That your mind exaggerates the intensity of the moment. That what feels unbearable often passes if you don't interfere. Think about that. Most reactions are not driven by reality, but by your interpretation of it. And once that becomes clear, something stabilizes inside you. You're no longer thrown off by every internal shift. You don't panic at the first sign of tension. You don't rush to resolve every feeling immediately. You become steady. Not because discomfort disappears, but because it no longer dictates your behavior. And this is where a deeper form of discipline begins to form. Not forced discipline, not rigid control, but composure. The ability to remain grounded, even when your internal state is unsettled. In the modern world, this is rare, because everything is designed to reduce discomfort instantly. Notifications, entertainment, stimulation, constant relief. So most people never develop this capacity. They react, they escape, they reset. But under retention, that cycle is interrupted. And what replaces it is awareness. And with that awareness, a different kind of strength begins to emerge. Quiet, stable, not dependent on external conditions. But this isn't the final layer. Because once you stop reacting to discomfort and start stabilizing your internal state, something else becomes very clear. Not just how you respond to yourself, but how you begin to move through the world differently. And that shift is where everything starts to reflect outward. At this stage, the change is no longer just internal. It begins to show. Not in obvious, dramatic ways, but in how you carry yourself, how you respond, how you move through situations. Because once your reactions slow down, once your impulses no longer dictate your behavior, there's a certain steadiness that develops. And people notice it. Not consciously at first, but they feel it. Your presence becomes more grounded. Your words become more deliberate. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't react to everything immediately. And that creates a different kind of impression. Not loud, not attention-seeking, but controlled. This is something that has been observed across different disciplines throughout history. In traditions like the samurai code of Bushido, composure wasn't just an internal practice. It was external. How you stood, how you spoke, how you responded under pressure. Because your internal state was expected to reflect outward in your behavior. Not through force, but through consistency. And that's what begins to happen here. You're no longer reacting randomly. Your behavior becomes aligned with your awareness. And that alignment creates something powerful. Predictability in yourself. You know how you'll respond. You trust your own restraint. And that changes how you move. You become less impulsive in conversations, less reactive in conflict, less dependent on external validation. Not because you're trying to appear that way, but because internally, things have stabilized. And this creates a feedback loop. The more stable you are internally, the more controlled your external behavior becomes. And the more controlled your external behavior becomes, the more confidence you develop in your internal state. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence, but quiet certainty. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself. And here's the key point most people miss. This isn't something you build artificially. It emerges naturally when your internal patterns are no longer chaotic. When your impulses are observed instead of obeyed. When your discomfort is understood instead of avoided. That's when your outer world begins to reflect your inner order. But this brings you back to the original truth. Retention didn't create this. It revealed it. It removed the noise. So what was already within you could become visible, clearly, consistently, and without distortion. So when people talk about retention as if it's some kind of transformation, they miss the point. It doesn't turn you into someone else. It shows you who you are, without interruption, without distraction, without the usual ways you escape yourself. And that clarity can go in two directions. It can be uncomfortable, because you start seeing patterns you can't ignore, weaknesses that were always there, habits that need to be addressed, reactions that no longer make sense once you're aware of them. But at the same time, it can be grounding, because you also begin to see your strengths more clearly, your ability to focus, your capacity for restraint, your potential for control, not as ideas, but as something real, something observable. And that's the shift. You stop guessing who you are, and you start seeing it directly, moment by moment, choice by choice, response by response. Retention simply removes the distortion. What remains is clarity, and clarity doesn't lie. It shows you exactly where you stand, not where you think you are, not where you want to be, but where you are, right now. And once you see that clearly, you have something most people never develop. A real starting point. If this made you look at yourself a little differently, take a moment and reflect on what it revealed. Not what you expected to find, but what actually showed up. And if you're willing, share your perspective in the comments. Because sometimes, seeing clearly starts with acknowledging what's there.